Now, starting the stream, but we're not actually doing anything until someone actually comes back because I'm not reading for nobody. So, until someone actually comes back and in the audience, I'm just going to sit here and do nothing. Like I said, I'm not actually going to start reading anything until there's someone actually here. So I apologize for anyone actually watching this VOD later, but right now I have no reason to actually start. So okay, someone's here, so we actually can start doing something. Now then, let me just pull up the screen share thing. Now it's actually gotten stuck a bit. Oh, there we go. Now, where's the image I was specifically... Wait, what? There we go. There it is. Okay. So, I'm currently reading a story by H.P. Lovecraft that he co-wrote for C.M. Eddy. He did 4 of these. I haven't read any of them. So, till today. So, I decided to read them on stream, and at least one of them. Well, we might read the other ones if I just would need to go and check, of course. I'm just going to. There we go. I'm also going to. Yes. So yeah, we can start now. I wish I had a book in my hand to actually seem erudite, but it is what it is. I'll just increase the screen size, and there we go. So, deaf, dumb, and blind. A little after. Sorry. Need to clear my mouth a bit just so that I don't. Okay. A little after noon on the 28th day of June, 1924, Dr. Morehouse stopped his machine before the Tanner place and 4 men alighted. The stone building, in perfect repair and freshness, stood near the road, and but for the swamp in the rear would have suggested no trace of dark suggestion. The spotless white doorway was visible across a trim lawn for some distance down the road, and as the doctor's party approached, it could be seen that the heavy portal yawned wide open. Only the screen door was closed. The close proximity of the house had imposed a kind of nervous silence on the 4 men, for what lurked therein could only be imagined with vague terror. This terror underwent a marked abatement when the explorers heard distinctly the sound of Richard Blake's typewriter. Less than an hour before, a grown man had fled from that house, hatless, coatless, and screaming, to fall upon the doorstep of his nearest neighbor, half a mile away, babbling incoherently of house, dark, swamp, and room. Dr. Morehouse had needed no further spur to excited action when told that a slavering, maddened creature had burst out of the old Tanner home by the edge of the swamp. He had known that something would happen when the 2 men had taken that accursed stone house. The men who had fled and his master, Richard Blake, the author poet from Boston, the genius who had gone into the war with every nerve and sense alert, and had come out as he was now, still debonair, though half a paralytic, still walking with song among the sights and sounds of living fantasy, though shut forever from the physical world, deaf, dumb, and blind. Blake had revealed in the weird traditions and shuddering hints about the house. Blake had revelled in the weird traditions and shuddering hints about the house and its former tenants. Such eldritch lore was an imaginative asset from whose enjoyment his physical state might not bar him. He had smiled at the prognostications of the superstitious natives. Now, with his sole companion fled in a mad ecstasy of panic fright, and himself left hapless with whatever had caused that fright, Blake might have less occasion to revel and smile. This, at least, was Dr. Morehouse's reflection, as he had faced the problem of the fugitive and called on the puzzled cottager to help him track the matter down. The Morehouses were an old Fenham family, and the doctor's grandfather had been one of those who burned the hermit Simeon Tamer's body in 1819. Not even at this distance could the trained physician escape a spinal tingle at what was recorded of that burning, at the naive inferences drawn by ignorant countrymen from a slight and meaningless conformation of the deceased. That tingle he knew to be foolish, for trifling bony protuberances on the forepart of the skull are of no significance and often observed in bald-headed men. Among the 4 men who ultimately set resolute faces towards that abhorrent house in the doctor's car, there occurred a singularly odd exchange of vague legends and half-furtive scraps of gossip handed down from curious grandmothers, legends and hints seldom repeated and almost never systematically compared. They extended as far back as 1692, when a tanner had perished on Gallows Hill in Salem after witchcraft trial, but did not grow intimate till the time the house was built, 1747, though the L was more recent. Not even then were the tales very numerous, for queer though the tanners all were, it was only the last of them, old Simeon, whom people desperately feared. He added to what he had inherited, added horribly, everyone whispered, and bricked up the windows of the south-east room, whose east wall gave on the swamp. That was his study and library, and it had a door of double thickness and braces. It had been chopped through with axes that terrible winter night in 1819, when the stinking smoke had poured from the chimney and they found Tanner's body in there with that expression on its face. It was because of that expression, not because of the 2 bony protuberances beneath the bushy white hair, that they had burned the body and the books and manuscripts it had had in that room. However, the short distance to the Tanner place was covered before much important historical matter could be correlated. As the doctor, at the head of the party, opened the screen door and entered the arched hallway, it was noticed that the sound of typewriting had suddenly ceased. At this point, 2 of the men also thought they had noticed a faint effusion of cold air, strangely out of keeping with the great heat of the day, though they afterwards refused to swear to this. The hall was in perfect order, as were the various rooms entered in quest of the study where Blake was presumably to be found. The author had furnished his home in exquisite colonial taste, and though having no help but the 1 manservant, he had succeeded in maintaining it as in a state of commendable neatness. Dr. Morehouse led his men from room to room through the wide open doors and archways, at last finding the library or study which he sought, a fine southerly room on the ground floor adjoining the once dreaded study of Simeon Tanner, lined with the books which the servant communicated through an ingenious alphabet of touches, and the bulky braille volumes which the author himself read with sensitive fingertips. Richard Blake, of course, was there, seated as usual before his typewriter, with a draft-scattered stack of newly written pages on the table and floor, and 1 sheet still in the machine. He had stopped work, it appeared, with some suddenness, perhaps because of a chill which had caused him to draw together the neck of his dressing-gown. and his head was turned toward the doorway of the sunny adjoining room in a manner quite singular for one whose lack of sight and hearing shuts out all senses of the external world. On drawing nearer and crossing to where he could see the author's face, Dr. Morehouse turned very pale and motioned to the others to stand back. He needed time to steady himself and to dispel all possibility of hideous illusion. No longer did he need to speculate why they had burned old Simeon Tanner's body on that wintry night because of the expression it wore, for there was something only a well-disciplined mind could confront. The late Richard Blake, whose typewriter had ceased its nonchalant clicking only as the men had entered the house, had seen something despite his blindness and had been affected by it. Humanity had nothing to do with the look that was on his face, or with the glassy, morbid vision that blazed in the great blue bloodshot eyes to the world's bloodshot eyes shut to this world's images for 6 years. Those eyes were fixed with an ecstasy of clear-sighted horror on the doorway leading to Simeon Tanner's old study, where the sun blazed on walls once shrouded in bricked-up blackness. And Dr. Arlo Morehouse reeled dizzily when he saw that for all the dazzling daylight the inky pupils of those eyes were dilated as cavernously as those of a cat's eyes in the dark. The doctor closed the staring blind eyes before he let the others view the face of the corpse. Meanwhile he examined the lifeless form with feverish diligence, using scrupulous technical care despite his throbbing nerves and almost shaking hands. Some of his results he communicated from time to time to the awed and inquisitive trio round him. Other results he judiciously withheld, lest they lead to speculations more disquieting than human speculations should be. Okay, just taking the chat for a second. It was not from any word of his, but from shrewd independent observation, that one of the men muttered about the body's tousled black hair and the way the papers were scattered. This man said it was as if a strong breeze had blown through the open doorway which the dead man faced, whereas although the once bricked windows beyond were indeed fully open to the warm June air, there had been scarcely a breath of wind during the entire day. When one of the men began to gather the sheets of the newly written manuscript as they lay on the floor and table, Dr. Morehouse stopped him with an alarmed gesture. He had seen the sheet that remained in the machine, and had hastily removed and pocketed it after a sentence or two blanched his face afresh. This incident prompted him to collect the scattered sheets himself and stuff them bulkily into an inside pocket without stopping to arrange them. And not even what he had read terrified him half so much as what he had now noticed, the subtle difference in touch and heaviness of typing which distinguished the sheets he picked up from the one he had found on the typewriter. This shadowy impression he could not divorce from that other horrible circumstance which he was so zealously concealing from the men who had heard the machines clicking not 10 minutes before. The circumstance he was trying to exclude from even his own mind till he could be alone and resting in the merciful depths of his Morris chair. One may judge of the fear he felt at that circumstance by considering what he braved to keep it suppressed. In more than 30 years of professional practice, he had never regarded a medical examiner as one from whom a fact might be withheld. Yet, though all the formalities which now followed, no man ever knew that when he examined this staring, contorted blind man's body, he had seen at once that death must have occurred at least half an hour before discovery. Dr. Morehouse presently closed the outer door and led the party through every corner of the ancient structure in search of any evidence which might directly illuminate the tragedy. Never was a result more completely negative. He knew that the trapdoor of old Simeon Tanner had been removed as soon as that recluse's books and body had been burnt, and that the sub-cellar and the sinuous tunnel under the swamp had been filled up as soon as they were discovered some 35 years later. Now he saw that no fresh abnormalities had come to replace them, and that the whole establishment exhibited only the normal neatness of modern restoration and tasteful care. Sorry, I just got a message. Okay, gonna check the chat again. Let's continue. Telephoning for the sheriff at Fenham and for the county medical examiner at Bayborough, he awaited the arrival of the former, who, when he came, insisted on swearing in two of the men as deputy. Who, when he came, insisted on swearing in two of the men as deputies until the examiner should arrive. Dr. Morehouse, knowing the mystification and futility confronting the officials, could not help smiling wryly as he left the villager whose house still sheltered the man who had fled. Oh, sorry for that noise. Sometimes this happens. It's the fan. Okay, let me just... yes. They found the patient exceedingly weak, but conscious and fairly composed. Having promised the sheriff to extract and transmit all possible information from the fugitive, Dr. Morehouse began some calm and tactful questioning, which was received in a rational and compliant spirit, and baffled only by effacement of memory. Much of the man's quiet must have come from merciful inability to recollect, for all he could now tell was that he had been in his study with his master and had seemed to see the next room suddenly grow dark, the room where sunshine had for more than 100 years replaced the gloom of bricked-up windows. Even this memory, which indeed he half doubted, greatly disturbed the unstrung nerves of the patient, and it was with the utmost gentleness and circumspection that Dr. Morehouse told him his master was dead, a natural victim of the cardiac weakness which his terrible wartime injuries must have caused. The man was grieved, for he had been devoted to the crippled author, but he promised to show fortitude in taking the body back to the family in Boston after the close of the medical examiner's formal inquiry. The physician, after satisfying as vaguely as possible the curiosity of the householder and his wife, and urging them to shelter the patient and keep him from the Tanner house until his departure with the body, next drove home in a growing tremble of excitement. At last he was free to read the typed manuscript of the dead man, and to gain at least an inkling of what hellish thing had defied those shattered senses of sight and sound, and penetrated so disastrously to the delicate intelligence that brooded in eternal darkness and silence. He knew it would be a grotesque and terrible perusal, and he did not hasten to begin it. Instead, he very deliberately put his car in the garage, made himself comfortable in a dressing gown, and placed a stand of sedative and restorative medicines beside the great chair he was to occupy. Even after that, he obviously wasted time as he slowly arranged the numbered sheets, carefully avoiding any comprehensive glance at their text. What the manuscript did to Dr. Morehouse, we all know. It would never have been read by another had his wife not picked it up as he lay inert in his chair an hour later, breathing heavily and unresponsive to a knocking which one would have thought violent enough to arouse a mummified pharaoh. Terrible as the document is, particularly in the obvious change of style near the end, we cannot avoid the belief that to the folklore-wise physician it presented some added and supreme horror which no other will ever be so unfortunate as to receive. Certainly, it is the general opinion of Fenham that the doctor's wide familiarity with the mutterings of old people, and the tales his grandfather told him in youth, furnished him some special information, in the light of which Richard Blake's hideous chronicle acquired a new, clear, and devastating significance, nearly insupportable to the normal human mind. That would explain the slowness of his recovery on that June evening, the reluctance with which he permitted his wife and son to read the manuscript, the singular ill-grace with which he acceded to their determination not to burn a document so darkly remarkable, and most of all, the peculiar rashness with which he hastened to purchase the old Tanner property, destroy the house with dynamite, and cut down the trees of the swamp for a substantial distance from the road. Concerning the whole subject, he now maintains an inflexible reticence, and it is certain that there will die with him a knowledge without which the world is better off. The manuscript, as here applauded, was copied through the courtesy of Floyd Morehouse Esquire, son of the physician. A few omissions indicated by asterisks have been made in the interest of the public peace of mind. Still others have been occasioned by the indefiniteness of the text, where the stricken author's lightning-like touch typing, where the stricken author's lightning-like touch typing seems shaken into incoherence or ambiguity. In 3 places where lacunae are fairly well elucidated by the context, the task of recension has been attempted. Of the change in style near the end it were best to say nothing. Surely it is plausible enough to attribute the phenomenon, as regards both content and physical aspect of typing, to the racked and tottering mind of a victim whose former handicaps had paled to nothing before that which he now faced. Bolder minds are at liberty to supply their own deductions. Here, then, is the document, written in an accursed house by a brain closed to the world's sights and sounds, a brain left alone and unwarned to the mercies and mockeries of powers that no seeing, hearing man has ever stayed to face. Contradictory as it is to all that we know of the universe through physics, chemistry, and biology, the logical mind will classify it as a singular product of dementia. A dementia communicated in some sympathetic way to the man who burst out of that house in time, and thus indeed may it be very well regarded, so long as Dr. Arlo Morehouse maintains his silence. The manuscript. Vague misgivings of the last quarter hour are now becoming definite fears. To begin with, I am thoroughly convinced that something must have happened to Dobbs. For the first time since we have been together, he has failed to answer my summons. When he did not respond to my repeated ringing, I decided that the bell must be out of order, but I have pounded on the table with vigor enough to rouse a charge of Charon. At first I thought he might have slipped out of the house for a breath of fresh air, but for it has been hot and sultry all forenoon. But it is not like Dobbs to stay away so long without making first sure that I would want nothing. It is, however, the unusual occurrence of the last few minutes which confirms my suspicion that Dobbs's absence is a matter beyond his control. It is this same happening which prompts me to put my impressions and conjectures on paper in the hope that the mere act of recording them may relieve a certain sinister suggestion of impending tragedy. Try as I will, I cannot free my mind from the legends connected with this old house, mere superstitions folderol for dwarf brains to revel in, and on which I would not even waste a thought if Dobbs were here. Through the years that I have been shut away from the world, I used to know Dobbs has been my sixth sense. Now, for the first time since my incapacitation, I realize the full extent of my impotency. It is Dobbs who has compensated for my sightless eyes, my useless ears, my voiceless throat, and my crippled legs. There is a glass of water on my typewriter table. Without Dobbs to fill it when it has been emptied, my plight will be like that of Tantalus. Few have come to this house since we have lived here. There is little in common between garrulous country folk and a paralytic who cannot see, hear, or speak to them. It may be days before anyone else appears, alone, with only my thoughts to keep me company, disquieting thoughts which have been in no wise assuaged by the sensations of the last few minutes. I do not like these sensations either, for more and more they are converting mere village gossip into a fantastic imagery which affects my emotions in a most peculiar and almost unprecedented manner. It seems hours since I started to write this, but I know it can only be a few minutes, for I have just inserted this fresh page into the machine. The mechanical action of switching the sheets, brief though it was, has given me a fresh grip on myself. Perhaps I can shake off this sense of approaching danger long enough to recount that which has already happened. At first it was no more than a mere tremor, somewhat similar to the shivering of a cheap tenement block when a heavy truck rumbles close by the curb. But this is no loosely built frame structure. Perhaps I'm super sensitive to such things, and it may be that I'm allowing my imagination to play tricks. But it seemed to me that the disturbance was more pronounced directly in front of me, and my chair faces the southeast wing, away from the road, directly in line with the swamp at the rear of the dwelling. Delusion though this may have been, there is no denying what followed. I was reminded of moments when I have felt the ground tremble beneath my feet at the bursting of giant shells, times when I have seen ships tossed like chaff before the fury of a typhoon. The house shook like a Dwargarian cinder in the sieves of Niflheim. Every timber in the floor beneath my feet quivered like a suffering thing. My typewriter trembled, and I could imagine that the keys were chattering of their fear. A brief moment, and it was over. Everything is as calm as before, altogether too calm. Sorry, I'm just going to check the chat for a second. There we go. There we go. It seems impossible that such a thing could happen and yet leave everything exactly as it was before. No, not exactly. I am thoroughly convinced that something has happened to Dobbs. It is this conviction, added to this unnatural calm, which accentuates the premonitory fear that persists in creeping over me. Fear? Yes, though I am trying to reason sanely with myself that there is nothing of which to be afraid. Critics have both praised and condemned my poetry because of that they term a vivid imagination. At such a time as this, I can heartily agree with those who cry too vivid. Nothing can be very much amiss, or smoke. Just a faint sulphurous trace, but one which is unmistakable to my keenly attuned nostrils. So faint indeed that it is impossible for me to determine whether it comes from some part of the house or drifts through the window of the adjoining room which opens on the swamp. The impression is rapidly becoming more clearly defined. I am sure now that... now I need to actually move forward because the text actually continues like 140 pages later for some reason. I don't know why, so hold on a second, please. Almost there. There we go. No, that's still... There we go. The last two... For some reason, I don't understand why the last 3 pages of this story have been confined to like page 179. So anyways, so continue the sentence in full. I am sure now that it does not come from outside. Vagrant visions of the past, somber scenes of other days flash before me in stereoscopic review. A flaming factory, hysterical screams of terrified women penned in by the walls of fire, a blazing schoolhouse, pitiful cries of helpless children trapped by collapsing stairs, a theatre fire, frantic babble of panic-stricken people fighting to freedom over blistering floors, and over all impenetrable cloud of black, noxious, malicious smoke polluting the peaceful sky. The air of the room is saturated with thick, heavy, stifling waves. At any moment I expect to feel hot tongues of flame lick eagerly at my useless legs. My eyes smart, my ears throb. I cough and choke to rid my lungs of the occipitanean fumes, smoke such as is associated only with appalling catastrophes, acrid, stinking, mephitic smoke permeated with the revolting odour of burning flesh. Once more I am alone with this portentous calm. The welcome breeze that fans my cheek is fast restoring my vanished courage. Clearly the house cannot be on fire, for every vestige of the torturous smoke is gone. I cannot detect a single trace of it, though I have been sniffing like a bloodhound. I am beginning to wonder if I am going mad, if the years of solitude had unhinged my mind, but the phenomenon has been too definite to permit me to class it as a mere hallucination. Sane or insane, I cannot conceive these things as aught but actualities, and the moment I catalogue them as such, I can come to only one logical conclusion. The inference in itself is enough to upset one's mental stability. To concede this to concede this is to grant the truth of the superstitious rumours which Dobbs compiled from the villages and transcribed for my sensitive fingertips to read. Unsubstantial hearsay that my materialistic mind instinctively condemns as asininity. I wish the throbbing in my ears would stop. It is as if mad spectral players were beating a duet upon the aching drums. I suppose it is merely a reaction to the suffocating sensations I have just experienced, a few more deep draughts of this refreshing air. Someone is in this room. I am as sure as I am no longer alone, as if I could see the presence I sense so infallibly. It is an impression quite similar to one which I have had while elbowing my way through a crowded street. The definite notion that eyes were singling me out from the rest of the throng with a gaze intense enough to arrest my subconscious attention. The same sensation only magnified 1,000-fold. What can it be? After all, my fears may be groundless. Perhaps it means only that Dobbs has returned. No, it is not Dobbs. As I anticipated, the tattoo upon my ears has ceased, and a low whisper has caught my attention. The overwhelming significance of the thing has just registered itself upon my bewildered brain. I can hear. It is not a single whispering voice, but many, lecherous buzzing of bestial blowflies, satanic humming of libidinous bees, sibilant hissing of obscene reptiles, a whispering chorus no human throat could sing. It is gaining in volume. The room rings with demoniacal chanting, tuneless, toneless, and grotesquely grim. A diabolical choir rehearsing unholy litanies, paeans of Mephistophelian mystery set to music of wailing souls, a hideous crescendo of pagan pandemonium. The voices that surround me are drawing near. The voices that surround me are drawing closer to my chair. The chanting has come to an abrupt end, and the whispering has resolved itself into intelligible sounds. I strain my ears to distinguish the words, closer and still closer. I'm just going to check the chat. Oh my. They are clear now, too clear. Better had my ears been blocked forever than forced to listen to their hellish mouthings. Impious revelations of soul-sickening saturnalia, ghoulish conceptions of devastating debaucheries, profane brides of Cabirian orgies, malevolent threats of unimagined punishments. It is cold, unseasonably cold, as if inspired by the cacodemonical presence that harassed me. The breeze that was so friendly a few minutes ago growls angrily about my ears. An icy gale that rushes in from the swamp and chills me to the bone. If Dobbs has deserted me, I do not blame him. I hold no brief for cowardice or craven fear, but there are some things. I only hope his fate has been nothing worse than to have departed in time. My last doubt is swept away. I am doubly glad now that I have held to resolve to write down my impressions. Not that I expect anyone to understand or believe. It has been a relief from the maddening strain of idly waiting for each new manifestation of psychic abnormality. As I see it, there are but 3 courses that may be taken: to flee from this accursed place and spend the torturous years that lie ahead in trying to forget. But flee I cannot. To yield to an abominable alliance with forces so malign that Tartarus to them would seem but an alcove of paradise, but yield I will not. To die, far rather would I have my body torn limb from limb than to contaminate my soul in barbarous barter with such emissaries of Belial. I had to pause for a moment to blow upon my fingers. The room is cold with the fetid frigor of the tomb. A peaceful numbness is creeping over me. I must fight off this lassitude. It is undermining my determination to die rather than give in to the insidious importunings. I vow anew to resist until the end that I know cannot be far away. The wind is colder than ever, if such a thing be possible, a wind frightened with the stench of dead alive things. O merciful God, who took my sight, a wind so cold it burns when it should freeze. It has become a blistering sirocco. Unseen fingers grip me, ghost fingers that lack the physical strength to force me from my machine, icy fingers that force me into a vile vortex of vice, devil fingers that draw me down into a cesspool of eternal iniquity, deaf fingers that shut off my breath and make my sightless eyes feel they must burst with pain, frozen points press against my temples, hard bony knobs akin to horns, boreal breath of some long dead thing kisses my fevered lips and sears my hot throat with frozen flame. It is dark, not the darkness that is part of years of blindness, the impenetrable darkness of sin-steeped night, the pitch-black darkness of purgatory. I see spes mea Christus, it is the end. Not for mortal mind is any resisting a force beyond human imagination. Not for immortal spirit is any conquering of that which hath probed the depths and made of immortality a transient moment. The end, nay, it is but the blissful beginning. So that was that one. It was Deaf, Dumb and Blind by Lovecraft and C. Eddy. Now, I'm going to go back through this collection, but I'm actually going to read something. Yes, I could potentially read more of the the Lovecraft Eddy ghostwritten stories, but I feel that probably should save those other ones for later, just so they have sort of a thing to lead into other streams. But now I'll actually go specifically because I am interested in reading. Okay, 180. Yes, but I will have to check how long this one is, because again, it's actually divided in 2 sections for some reason in the same magazine. So we have the Bloody Moon. How many pages is this? This one. Sorry, I'm just waiting for it to load. I'm waiting for the page to load to actually do something, because it doesn't want to load in the. I'm just going. Or it's loading it very slowly at the moment. I just want to see how many. Oh god, this is taking a while. Sorry, I'm just going to very quickly check something else. Okay, that works. That works. Could you please finish loading? Sorry, I don't. Okay, yes. Okay, that's okay. So continued from page 12. So that means, yes. So that means that it's only 3 pages. I don't know why they do this, where they have like half the story in the first half of the magazine, and then the other half is 150 pages later. It doesn't seem very sensible to me. But anyway, the next story we are reading is called "Bloody Moon" by Harry Harrison Kroll. I'm going to try and I don't really know what the illustration is, honestly. It's kind of very hard to make out, so probably not even that not really that useful. So let me see what. Let me just come on now. I don't need this one. I'm trying to find something visually interesting for the to showcase here, but the illustration on this one's pretty damn terrible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and get the cover for this particular issue of Weird Tales. There's not, I need the one from 1924, not 1928. Okay, 1920. Wait, is it this 1925? I believe. I just have to check real quick. Yes, 1925, the April issue. So we're going to just very quickly try. Oh, here we are. I actually remember seeing this before. I don't know what this is. We might read the title story of this. If I can actually find. I just want a picture. I don't want to load it again. Sorry. It's not that much better, but it's. Now, will you actually load, or are you gonna? Okay, now. Okay, I don't. Okay, yeah, I'm just gonna share this now. I can Turn this off. So now we are going to read. Bloody Moon by Harry Harrison Kroll. So I'm just going to make this bigger, and I'm going to continue. And I seriously cannot. I'm just going to show you the title image for a second. This is the title page, and I want to show you what the illustration on it looks like. Because I have not the faintest idea what I'm looking at here. I guess that's a woman, and I guess that's maybe a person falling over, and I thought that was a boulder, but I guess it's a moon. Anyways, not exactly that great. Now we're just going to switch over to the cover because that just doesn't look good. Anyway, Bloody Moon. At rare intervals, usually in the spring of the year, a singular phenomenon known as the Bloody Moon occurs in the cavernous region of Kentucky. The Indians whom Daniel Boone knew in this section had a tradition in connection with the peculiar occurrence of the effect that the bloody moon brings swift woe to him that sees it. Henry Pearson sat on the steps of his dwelling just after the fall of night. Through the timber along the top of the ridge he caught the first glow of the rising moon. Suddenly the orb shot above the line of timber top. Then, for the first time in his life, he had a clear view of the old Indian bloody moon. By the way, I should note this is written in 1925, so there's going to be some period language. Although that one sort of slipped by, and I think that one should theoretically be okay, but I'm not going to try to. But if I'm going to try not to, but I'm definitely not going to be reading any period slurs or anything. So let's actually continue. Yes. It fascinated him while it horrified him. Seemingly there was nothing about the sight to occasion fright, yet something about it, some magnetic uncanniness seemed to freeze the very blood in his veins. For a full minute it glowed at him, then the planetary face brightened to its normal tint, and the bloody moon vanished as suddenly as with as little apparent reason as it had appeared. Pearson did not regard himself as a superstitious person. Still, he reflected, he had ample basis for his present unnerved condition. The timbers of the house of Pearson knew to quake at the recurrence of the bloody moon. The thing went far back into pioneer days. A century and a half before, the land of which his home was a part had been secured to old Alligator Pearson, a first settler by patent from the territorial government of Kentucky. The aboriginal title was held by an Indian chief named Eagle Fire. In spite of his terror-inspiring name, the Indian was a peaceful old man, and Pearson, brutal and fearless, with a handful of pioneers, dispossessed the harmless old man and his tribe by the simple expedient of killing them. Only one was permitted to live, the old chief's daughter. She was a pretty, fawn-skinned girl of 16, and Alligator Pearson took her to wife by clubbing her into submission. When the child was born, the princess died, but she never gave in to her white husband in the spirit, for she died with a curse on her lips to the father of her babe. Her last words, reported by the lean women who waited on her in her sickness, were, "Live on, my son, and avenge the blood of your people with the bloody moon." When the boy was 18, Alligator Pearson died. It was said tradition, the time of the year when the bloody moon occurred. The neighbors found the stark form of the old pioneer in the trail leading to his cabin. He lay face downward in the path without mark of violence on his person. Yet he had died in terror, with twisted face and staring eyes. 20 years later, the second Pearson, by a white wife who followed the princess, was in a like manner at about the same time of year assassinated. A kindred mystery shrouded his death. The bloody moon had been seen an hour previously by his wife, as she had gone down the road to a tobacco field to look for him. Supper being delayed and growing cold, and she uneasy and fearful. She found him among the tobacco plants, face to the ground, eyes and mouth full of dust. In his own lifetime, young Pearson had twice known the shock of his swift, inexplicable visitation. The first occasion came about the time he was 10 years old. Grandfather Pearson, third in line from the original pioneer, hale and hearty, had eaten his supper and retired, his bedroom being the roof room under the gable. The rest of the family were in the living room below. His granny knitting, his mother enjoying her after-supper dip of snuff, and his father smoking. Suddenly the very oaken rafters of the old house quivered from the frightful scream. He dashed with his father up to the roof room. They found the old man alone, sitting starkly up in his bed, his eyes wide and staring, the breath only a moment since left his body. They found no sign on the old man's person, more than a tiny abrasion on his grey, hairy chest. But the time was spring of the year, at the full of the moon, and the flood of light through the window upon the puncheon floor was as red as blood. When he looked again, the glow had mellowed to its normal milk white. Was it the bloody moon that had killed his grandsire? The doctor pronounced the cause heart failure. Who could deny that the practitioner was correct in his diagnosis? For often enough the human heart does fail when the sins of the father begin their grim visitation down the generations. The details of his own father's taking off he did not often reflect upon. The tragedy was still too poignant, too recent. The time was a year before, at the first full moon in May. His father visited Bowling Green that day, making a trip on muleback. He was expected home before sundown, but something must have delayed him, for night fell and he had not returned. The moon had risen when mule and rider appeared at the front gate. It was his father's custom to dismount there and halloo for some of the boys to come out and put up and feed the mule. This time no such familiar call came. Going to the door to see why his father did not dismount and come in, young Pearson saw beast and rider, statuesque in the red flood of moonlight, in the vivid vision of tragic death. The mark of the curse of the Indian bloody moon was written indelibly on the sagging, lifeless body of his parent. He carried the old man in and placed him upon the bed in the living room, but no one ever knew how he had come by his death. Now he had just seen in all its terrible portent the bloody moon, and the time was spring of the year in the month of May. Pearson rose shakily, going into the house and closing and bolting the door. Perhaps it would be a useless precaution, but he felt better. He would have to be cautious now, he told himself. What to guard against he had not the remotest idea. Still, he would have to take care. It was the very vagueness of the enemy which troubled him most. If it were a man, he would have known easily enough some of the things to do, but this enemy was unnameable, supernatural. It was about 9 o'clock in the evening when Pearson heard one of the mules down at the barn kicking its stall door. Just checking the chat for a second. He was a farmer and knew well enough that this might mean a valuable farm animal would break its legs if permitted to continue its foolish ways. He went out to the rear gate. The mule had escaped from its stall, dashed out of the lot by leaping the low fence into the tobacco, and was now snorting and cavorting about among the plants in great show of brutish agitation. He called the beast, but with only indifferent results. Meanwhile, he looked about among the plants and in the weeds and shadows back of the stable for some signs of what had caused this unwanted disturbance. The mules were not in the habit of breaking out of their stalls and galloping about in this manner. He clambered the fence, still speaking gently to the mule. The beast made a lateral swing down into a hollow at the spring course below the house. A short distance down the drain was one of the sinkholes characteristics of this cavernous limestone country. The frightened mule disappeared around the clump of bushes which fringed this opening. Pearson could not have explained with any certainty afterward just what exactly did occur. He had a vague impression of a dim figure that darted from out of the undergrowth and caught him from the rear, but neither his sight nor feeling could be relied upon. He suffered no sensation of physical contact, much less of pain. All he knew was that he suddenly found his steps arrested, his body sliding through the dust and dry leaves and brush which clung about the edges of the hole. Nothing he did served to stay his fall. He went tumbling headfirst into the hole. It seemed that he fell into the very depths of the earth. In his frantic struggles to break his descent, he had scant idea of distance, but he dimly sensed the depth of the hole to be 100 feet. He landed at the bottom finally, with plenty of bruises but no broken bones, friction with the narrow walls aiding him to slack his speed. He stood in absolute darkness. He stretched forth his hand cautiously, finding a continuation of the passage in a horizontal direction. The walls were smooth and the passageway of a size comfortably to admit his body. He had spent many an hour in exploring the caves of the vicinity, mammoth caves a few miles away he had known all his life. When his first weakness had passed, he began crawling on hands and knees along the tube. It seemed to follow the general direction of the river bluff, a half-mile away. He had never heard of a cave opening out on the face of the bluff, still there could be something of the sort. Clearly he could expect to get out no other way, since escape back up through the sinkhole was impossible. At times he paused and listened, thinking that something, perhaps the thing that had tripped him up, was following, but no sound reached his ears. It was a premonition that was all. Much more a spirit than anything resembling an actuality. After 100 yards he entered a cavernous chamber. The place was cool, but the air was dry. Away off somewhere he could hear the dull roar of the water. He surmised that the stream was Lost River, whose course lay for the most part in the bowels of the earth, with its mouth at the foot of the bluff on Green River. If he could push through and not get drowned in its treacherous waters, he might eventually expect to live. Otherwise, but he did not think of that now. From his pocket he drew a packet of cigarettes and matches. A man might as well die with a good smoke in his mouth as any other way. The light of the match would aid him in getting his bearings, but neither cigarettes nor matches were to be wasted. He put the roll of tobacco in his mouth and struck the match with his thumbnail. The cigarette was never lighted. In the glow of the faint flame something stared at him, the thing that had been following him. Whether flesh or spirit he could not have said. It had the form of a woman, and it stood with folded arms and dead, emotionless eyes peering at him. It looked through him, beyond him, rather than at him. In his nervousness he neglected to extinguish the match quickly enough, and in the interval the thing measured him, his strength and prowess, and the next instant it was upon him. The first encounter was swift and illuminating. It was human and it was merciless. He broke the first clinch with army tactics, sidestepped, then waited, drawing his breath as silently as possible so as not to betray his position, an expedient his assailant did not observe, for he could hear her laboured breathing a dozen steps away. He considered with some rapid mental calculation the disadvantages against which he worked. The other had the advantage of being on familiar ground and accustomed to the blackness of the place. She knew the exits of the place, if any existed, and how to cut off any chance retreat. But he reasoned that there must be an opening, if nothing more than the mouth of Lost River, and he must play for that one fact alone. He doubted not that this was the inevitable mouth of the bloody moon. Whether a ghost of the Indian princess whom his ancestor had abused, or a descendant of that child born to transmit the curse, mattered little in the long run. The one thing which he accepted was that the curse was by way of being visited upon him, and in the law of probabilities yet scant chance of escaping the fate that had taken off in turn every male head of the house since the days of old Alligator Pearson. He did not know what the others had seen, what his grandfather had seen that night in the roof-room, or his father had encountered on his way home from Bowling Green. Nothing was vouchsafed him that he might defend himself intelligently. All he knew was that he was in for a fight to the bitter finish. His wind came back to him. Presently. He reached forth a cautious hand. The floor was smooth. The walls were all the tips of his fingers. Oh, sorry, the walls were at the tips of his fingers. He strained his ears for some sound from the enemy. Her breathing, too, had become normal. He was, in fact, uncertain whether or not she was still there. Then, with silent deftness, he drew himself to his feet. He had hoped to sidestep swiftly upon gaining his equilibrium, duck again, and by second lateral leap evade the attack his movement would inevitably bring about, unless he miscalculated the venom of his enemy. The plan was perfect, except that he had not taken account of his creaking joints. Oh my. The snapping of his ankles betrayed his stratagem. The thing was upon him again. He fought now with deadly earnestness, nor was he a weakling. The labour in the tobacco fields has tutored his muscles in... Sorry, I need it. In flexibility and endurance. His overseas service had taught him some tricks of this fighting game. He beat out with his fists. He took the clenches and played for blood. Always the hands worked for his throat. And what curious hands they were, long and murderous with nails like razors. Once they caught in his face and he felt the warm blood drip upon his defending arms. For a moment he fancied he had gained the ascendancy when by a terrific blow with no better aim than blind instinct he smacked the unseen face. The thing staggered back. But he had hardly regained his own scattered faculties before the battle was resumed with bloody determination. He'd sidestep whenever possible, retreating as opportunity offered. He had to feel his way carefully, however, for the jumping off is always a menace in cave explorations, and he was satisfied that there was a subterranean cliff leaping down to the waters of Lost River. As he retreated, he became aware that the roar of the stream was increasing in intensity. He sloshed into some water once, by which token he knew the passage was going farther down into the earth. A sudden fear, such as takes possession of one in the darkness when he imagines that he is in the act of stepping off, compelled him to hands and knees. He put his foot back. Less than a yard back, his toe went suddenly over an edge. His instinct and knowledge of caverns had not played him false. Had he stayed on his feet and continued his retreat, he would have crashed to his doom far down into the hole through which the waters of Lost River now roared. Had the woman paused, expecting him to go over the ledge? He remembered now. Several yards back he had sensed a branching of the passages. Cool air came from one direction, warm air from another. The cool air, it was evident, blew from the water whose roar filled his ears. The warm air doubtless came from an inlet somewhere at the surface. The thought that he had gone the other way, that had he gone the other way, he might beat up to the freedom. The thought that, had he gone the other way, he might beat up to freedom sickened him. There was nothing to do now but renew the attack again, to gain the other passage, the mouth of which he was probably guarding. Every instant when he was fighting the creature, he expected to feel a sharp thrust and a death reaction to some poison, such as had probably taken off his father and grandfather. So I'm checking the chat again. But he could not wait long here in inaction. Already his muscles were stiffening, and the bruises and abrasions about his body growing painful. He swore under his breath. Old Alligator Pearson had been slain back there in those distant days, and he had deserved his punishment. Why couldn't the curse have stopped with the real offender? That was the trouble with one of those crimes. They somehow were never expiated until about the 10th generation. There remained nothing but to return to the battle. He got his blood going by waving his arms and flexing his muscles, and then he started cautiously forward. He was making his way steadily along when suddenly he all but stumbled over the woman. The sound of his footfalls had been muffled by the roar of Lost River, and she had not heard his approach until he was upon her. The battle recommenced with a fury that brooked no quarter. The rest that had chilled and stiffened him more than it had refreshed him appeared to have been as wine to the savage Amazon. He pushed her away from him, striking blindly again and again, but without avail. Her claws slashed his face and arms. Once she caught one of his fingers between her teeth and nearly bit it off. The terrible pain blinded him into semi-consciousness. With With this as an advantage, he pushed him back toward the chasm. Nearer and nearer he felt himself forced to the brink of the precipice. In a sudden reaction of angry energy, he determined that his foe should die with him. If she lived in the flesh, she should now die in its mortality. His foot felt the brink of the jumping off. The time had come. He had been falling back, trying to keep at arm's length from the woman, but now he changed his tactics and made a desperate clinch. He gave a frantic pull, and together they went over the brink. In the protracted fall through the Stygian blackness, he had some curiously clear impressions. The roar of the water seemed to rise to meet them. The draught of the flue was sharp and filled with chill particles of moisture. The woman who fell with him accepted their common fate with a strange, dull passivity. Her body was warm and not without a certain charm of touch which instinct told him was that of youth. It was a curious paradox that after many minutes of furious battling, in which nothing but death could close the issue, his hand should be upon her breast, and he could feel the flutter of her heart. Then came the impact. The chill waters of Lost River seemed to gather them up in a roaring, breathless embrace. He had always been a good swimmer. The waters of Green River could bear testimony as to that. Instinctively he held his breath. The swirl carried him and the woman swiftly away from the churning froth where the hurtling waters reached the earth again. It came to him that he was not gone after all. He had not considered the saucer which is always to be found at the foot of a fall, hollowed out by ages of falling water to a depth of many feet. His courage revived by the turn of fortune. He began to figure his way out. From his knowledge of the locality, he judged that he was less than 100 yards from safety, where the subterranean stream came finally to light in the waters of Green River. Oh, sorry, I'm checking chat again. If he could last for 5 minutes, life would be his. The woman seemed lifeless in his arms now, but she did not hinder his movements. The sweeping waters carried them both like corks. He found, too, that in spite of the low roof of the stream's bed, his head more often than not emerged in a pocket of air that permitted him a long breath. The passageway widened, narrowed again, then the waters, half joyfully, half vengefully, suddenly evicted him out of the bowels of the earth into the rocky bed of the Green River. The woman was still with him, her hair floating on the cottony waters, the brilliant light of the high-riding moon tracing her features into a picture far from unlovely. He dragged both her and himself to the sandy bank. Her features were Indian, but with a pleasant variant duty. Here we go. This is not an endorsement, and we're going to be going about, oh, yeah, she's Indian, but she's partially white, so that means she's actually better. Anyway. But with a pleasant variance due to her unmistakable white blood. Her berry-brown skirt and gypsy hair came from her aboriginal ancestry, the rotundity of chin and mould of cheek from her Nordic stock. Her clothing was a nondescript garment of skins and rags, and even the bruises about her body and the clotted blood in cuts about her neck, arms, and shoulders did not mar the beauty of her maidenhood. Her body rested limply on the sand, the last of the curse of the Indian bloody moon. He dropped to his knees by her and began chafing her hands. Between times he built a fire by flaking 2 flint rocks together Indian fashion and catching the sparks in rotten wood. Thereafter he worked with her to better purpose, and presently she was sufficiently revived for him to remove her to the house, where he turned her over to the tender ministrations of his mother. The rest of the story came by degrees over a long period of time, while the girl learned the language of her white ancestry. Much of what she recounted was merely her own tradition, but it pieced in well with the facts in young Pearson's possession and was entirely plausible. The son of the Indian princess and old alligator Pearson had taken to the caves after he became grown, wifing an Indian girl from a remnant of an allied tribe. In course of time he had killed his father, passing the curse of his mother on to sons and daughters of his own. In course of time he had died. The charge had been carried faithfully out by each succeeding generation, usually with a poison made from the venom of a moccasin snake and certain plants whose identity had become lost to the girl. And so, because of the pressure of getting food and the life under the earth, her people had all but passed away, leaving her to complete the curse. She had lost the formula for the poison. In desperation, she had worked out the present plan, hoping to get the last of the Pearsons into the cave and starve him to death, or drown him over the falls of Lost River. The rest of this tale is another story, but so far as the house of Pearson was concerned, the Bloody Moon superstition became merely an old wives' tale. The next Pearson in line was a fawn-skinned boy who would never know a sense of dread when the month of May brought a blood-red moon in the evening sky. So there was that one. And let me see how... We are over an hour, so that would definitely be at least a minimum length for a stream. But I'm considering doing at least one more story here. And that would be, of course, the Atlantis story is a bit long, isn't it? Oh, no, that's a different one. Hold on there. Yeah, that one's fairly lengthy. Plus, there's that one. We've got this one. Trying to find one which is not that long. This one actually seems to be not okay. This one's. I am going to keep this one. I'm going to keep the title page of this one. So I'm going to actually show off the illustration, the heading illustration, however you want to call it, for this one. So there we go. I hate how it always small when I put it. So this one is The Grim Passenger by Donald Edward Kehoe. I have no idea how to pronounce that. I'm hoping I'm somewhere in the ballpark. Because of the ridicule generally attaching itself to anyone admitting to the possibility of the supernatural, I have until now refrained from setting forth the details of certain events which apparently led to a widely known and regretted disaster in mid-Atlantic several years ago. But the opening of the tomb of King Tutankhamun and the intending publicity brought the matter back to my mind, and I shall offer it to the public to believe or not as it chooses. I think I know what this is about. This is another story. This is maybe I think I've read another book, which I reviewed on the channel years ago, which actually include two books, which were somehow I don't remember exactly. The first one definitely, The Lure of Purple Star, definitely included the sinking of the Titanic as a plot point, and I think that one came out like a year after the sinking of the Titanic. This one comes like 14 years later, so it's not as in poor taste. And I know there was another one where I think the Titanic sinking was actually a small subplot. But yeah, it appears this one is going to be a story about how the curse of Tutankhamun caused the sinking of the Titanic. I'm just going to read this as it is, and we'll see. Even now do I not admit that there was anything supernatural about it. There was something strange and terrible about it, no one will deny. For obvious reasons, certain names have been omitted or changed, but with these exceptions I have related everything exactly as it occurred. In my position as secretary to the president of the Bee Museum of London, I have charge of sending out expeditions in search of valuable specimens, ancient and otherwise. For some time during the year of we have been on the trail of a mummy case supposed to contain the dead body of a certain king whose name is to be found in history of centuries long past. Creditable information having at last been obtained as to the location of the tomb containing the mummy, I sent for a man whose name may be remembered even now as that of a famous museum supplier, a man who was well versed in such work and who was thoroughly dependable because of his matter-of-fact and common-sense nature. I shall call him Thomas D. Stevenson. Acquainting him with all the facts at my disposal, I gave him an order for such equipment as he would need, and sufficient funds to cover all expenses of the trip. 2 days later he left London for a spot not very far from that at which the present activities are taking place. Less publicity was given the matter, however, than at the present time because of reasons which concerned a slight difficulty in regard to the law. So we were robbing tombs then. Okay, or pilfering antiquities. This was I see. We're talking about the British Museum then, aren't we? You thought you were being clever, but your one error was being British, and therefore me being able to identify that. After reaching his destination, Stevenson encountered obstacles in obtaining guides and other natives to help him in the excavation. They were finally obtained, however, and after considerable effort the Englishman and his party located the long-lost tomb. Within a few days the main entrance of the great vault was partially uncovered, and preparations were made for opening it, when the natives suddenly drew off to one side, muttering and casting awestruck looks at the door, which bore in ancient language an inscription that had been cut into the metal that formed the outer part. When Stevenson peremptorily ordered them back to their work, the head native approached him, tremblingly, and pointed out a little dried-up old man who seemed to hold a position of importance among the others. "Master," he said, "he has told us the meaning of the words, and we are afraid." "You fool," Stevenson stormed. "What is there on that door to frighten men living hundreds of years after it was erected?" "It says," answered the cowed native, "that he who sleeps there has left his spirit to guard his body, and that any who touch it shall die." "Damned nonsense," roared the other, and went on trying to drive the men back to their work. But neither threats, cajolery, nor offers of higher pay would move them. The little old man had frightened them with his translation of the words on the door, and the inbred superstitions of generations did the rest. Seeking a full solution of the problem, Stevenson asked the old native for a translation of the warning, and this is what he heard: "Turn ye away, lest ye become as I. On them who heed not my warning shall my curse fall, and it shall be so until my body rests again undisturbed." At the bottom of these words was a seal bearing the profile of a crowned head. Even Stevenson felt a vague uneasiness and misgiving at this, but he shook off his doubts with a laugh at the momentary weakness, and again attempted to force the men to the work. Finding them determinedly against it, he dismissed them and set about getting other aid, which was no small matter in that out-of-the-way place. Finally, a nondescript outfit of drifters and ne'er-do-wells were assembled, and the vault was opened. To the relief of Stevenson and the disappointment of the men, there was very little treasure found, although this is now believed to have been in a second vault nearby. The much-desired mummy case, however, lay on a terraced stonework, covered with symbols and signs which later proved to be an almost complete history of the life of the dead king. On closer examination, Stevenson was startled to find reproduced in the center of the case the identical warning that had been seen on the door. For a moment the Englishman had an almost overpowering impulse to drop the whole thing and return to England and the museum empty-handed. He quickly stifled this and curtly gave the order that started the body of the dead monarch on its journey far from its wished-for resting-place to the bustling, unmindful city of London. Then began the journey to the nearest seaport. Singularly restless and impatient for one of his stolid nature, Stevenson rushed his men, already tired from work, until fever set in and delayed him while he tended to the sick. Instead of yielding to rest and recognized remedies, the fever took a more malignant form, and before the party reached their port 5 men had succumbed. The others, a curious fear having descended upon them, cursed the mummy, Stevenson, and the expedition heartily and impartially, nor did they lose any time in severing their connection with the outfit once the mummy case was on board ship and their pay was in their pockets. Stevenson, his mind wearied and in a turmoil from which the trying happenings of the present happenings of the preceding weeks, turned in at his hotel, hoping to enjoy a good rest, but instead tossed and turned throughout most of the night. Rising early, preparatory to embarking on his ship, he was astonished to find a local police official awaiting him. "What is it?" demanded the Englishman, brusquely, short-tempered from worry and lack of sleep. "Sir, it is that we wish you to identify some bodies," answered the smiling, suave official, as if he were suggesting a stroll in the cool of the morning. I'm just checking the chat. "Bodies," gasped the other. "Whose? What bodies?" "Sir, they are 5 men who are said to have come with you from Z yesterday. That last night they became very drunk in one of the places down on the old docks and started a brawl in which several were hurt and 3 of your party were killed. The other 2 attempted escape when our men arrived and were fatally wounded before they submitted to arrest. One died at once and the other but a few minutes ago." It was with an effort that Stevenson shook off the depression that this news brought to him, and complied with the police regulations in identifying the dead men and giving his rather slight knowledge of each one. This done, he hurried back to his hotel and at once proceeded to his ship, endeavouring all the time to shake off a foreboding that had begun to be a very part of his mind. Insistently, the thought hammered itself into his every waking moment and brought him sinister dreams that of all the men who had entered the forbidden tomb and had defied the warnings that had protected the dead king for centuries, he alone still lived. Again and again he told himself that the deaths were accidental and in the course of natural events. Fever was a common thing, and scores of men were killed in just such quarrels as had occurred on the preceding night. Then before him would come a vision of the mummy case with its silent warning, and his bolstered up confidence and courage would fall in a house of cards. He had been guiltier than the men who helped him in violating that warning. How long would he escape the vengeance of the power that had taken the lives of the rest? Already unwell from his efforts in the desert, Stevenson rapidly became worse until by the time his ship had reached England he was a mental and physical wreck. Then it was that we of the museum heard of his plight and went to his aid, removing him to a hospital in the mummy case in the basement of the museum. At the bedside of the sick man, several of the lesser officials of the institution listened to his story, but when he related the details of the horrors that had attended every moment since the removal of the dead king from the tomb, they raised their eyebrows and nodded to each other in expressions of their belief that the heat and the solitude had been a little too much for him. Little attention was paid then, when at the close of his narrative Stevenson raised himself up on one shoulder and his eyes gleaming in a fierce, unnatural way, cried out, "Don't let them keep the mummy! Have him taken back! Take him back before it is too late!" An attendant rushed up quickly and soothingly pushed the sick man back into his bed, while the others withdrew, hardly giving a second thought to the words of the man they had just left, feeling only a natural sorrow at the affliction which his long stay in the tropics had brought him. 2 days later Stevenson died, raving about the mummy and uttering warnings to the effect that it should be taken back to the tomb. His words were ascribed to delirium, and no attention was paid to them at the time. Then the mummy case was brought to the central exhibition room and placed within a case especially prepared for it. While someone was studying the symbols on the case, the inscription was noted, and its meaning found by referring to our records of ancient languages. But the thing was taken more as a joke by everyone in the museum than as anything of serious meaning. And then, without further warning, tragedy invaded the museum itself. For the very morning, the night watchman, for that very morning, the night watch, sorry, for the very next morning, the night watchman was found dead directly in front of the museum case, his eyes wide open and a look of mortal terror in them, while his face was rigid and drawn with fear, as if the man had died while looking on something so dreadful that his mind had instantly become crazed, even as his overtaxed heart burst from horror. Sorry. No reason could be assigned, and after a searching investigation, a verdict was reached by the coroner's jury that death was due to failure of the heart, the unnatural pose in which the dead man was found to be due to his fear at dying, being added to by the darkness and silence in which he was when the attack seized him. This was most unsatisfactory, but no other this was most unsatisfactory, but no other explanation was forthcoming. Hardly had we recovered from this shock when early one afternoon I was startled to hear the sound of a fall, and rushing into the president's room I found him lying on the floor breathing his last. As I raised his head up from the floor, the dying man gasped out, "Send back the mummy! Send him back to—" Before he could finish the words, he sank back limply. A quickly summoned doctor pronounced his death due to a nervous disorder that had affected the heart. That ended the stay of the mummy in the museum. Before another day we had it carried to the basement, although it was with difficulty that we could prevail on anyone to go near the now greatly feared body. Arrangements were underway for sending it back to its former resting place when we received a call from Basil G. Stoddard, the representative of an American museum of no small fame. Mr. Stoddard wished to see the cause of the mysterious events, which had by that time been well discussed in the newspapers. He was insistent, and I finally gave in to the extent of allowing him to enter the room where we had locked up the mummy case. The upshot of it all was that he decided to buy it from us, although we told him every known happening that had been attributed to its baleful influence. I do not believe any of the deaths were caused by this dried-up old body, he said. Because sometimes foreshadowing is fairly obvious. As for the warning, it was only a natural desire to keep robbers from prying into his tomb that caused him to take such a course. Yeah, that's true, but knowing the superstitious nature of the people, he saw that such a caution would be his best protection, rather. The value to me and to the institution I represent is in the mummy itself and the case, which has certain unusual figures worked into it. Well, I shall be glad to be rid of it, I returned. I do not like to believe that there is anything connecting the deaths and the mummy itself which cannot be explained by psychology of fear, but at any rate we shall all breathe more easily when the thing is no longer under our care. Just 1 week later, Stoddard sailed for New York. With flags flying bravely, bands playing inspiring music, and hundreds of passengers waving goodbye to their friend on shore, the then largest ship of her class slowly dropped downstream and commenced her maiden voyage. Oh, we are definitely doing this. I can already sense it. With not a thought of anything but a wonderful journey before them on that floating palace, the passengers began their customary plans for shortening the time and making it more agreeable. There was but one exception to this. One passenger lay deeply in the hold, unmoving, apparently an inanimate, though rather gruesome bit of cargo. But who knows but there radiated from that dead body a terrible malevolence which was destined to bring death and disaster to the gay crowd that thronged the decks above. Who knows but that this malevolent influence, all powerful because of centuries through which it had existed and grown, perhaps penetrated to the minds of those who guided the destinies of the great ship, that it did not give to the captain of the vessel an all-consuming desire to break the highest records for speed to the American port, and that this desire would render him careless of danger, of reports of drifting icebergs, causing him to drive his ship farther and farther into peril. Who knows but that this influence, if such there was, vicious, unpitying, and ruthless in its desire for vengeance at its violated warning, perhaps swerved each mind to its purpose, even reaching up to the lookout in the crow's nest, and making him slow in seeing that vast floating danger which loomed up in the path of the ship carrying those precious souls, until the colossal mass of ice crashed into the oncoming ship, crushing it like a shell and dooming many of those on board to death or separation from loved ones, and the others to terrible memories that will live with them forever. And perhaps as that once proud ship settled below the waves to its final resting place, the dead king exulted in fiendish triumph as he went down to rule over the world of dead about him in that greatest of tombs, the steamship Titanic. I said that was going to happen. I said we're going to be going there. Oh boy, yeah, that definitely was the thing. I don't know why so many people were trying to ascribe supernatural significance to the Titanic's sinking, but very well. Now then, I'm going to see. I have perhaps. Okay, this is not that long if it doesn't continue elsewhere later. Shiburi Quinn. How long is this one? Sorry, I don't know how to say Shiburi. Okay, I have another thing planned, and it is a short story from this issue. It's not that long, and it's called. I'm just going to. There we go. It is Servants of Satan by Seabury Quinn. So I believe that would be a good thing to see us off then. I'm just going to go here and start. The black March wind rushed pell-mell through the narrow unpaved roadways of Salem village. It tore at tradesmen's signboards with a bellow, it rapped with frozen fingers at the dwellings' tight-barred shutters, then fled with a whoop of maniacal laughter past Salem village church to scream and howl round the Putnam homestead like a chained wolf straining at his leash. In an upper room of the strong, weather-stained house, a girl worked with an uneasy whimper and looked into the darkness of her low-ceiled bedroom with round, fearful eyes, listening to the screeching of the midnight wind. A moment she lay thus, then sat bolt upright, her mouth squared in a cry of mortal terror. "And, child, what ails thee?" Goodman Putnam swung back the door of his daughter's chamber and flashed the subdued light of his lanthorn about the room. "Oh, father, the girl," she was only 12 years old, cried. "The witch-woman, the wicked witch-woman was here." "Nonsense, child," her father answered testily. "Thou knowest the witches are in Ipswich jail. How can they plague thee now?" "Nathless, father," Anne Putnam replied stubbornly. "The witch was here but a moment agone. I saw her come down the chimney astride her broom handle, looking at me with great red eyes." Goodman Putnam drew his flannel bedgown more tightly about his shoulders and looked fearfully at the fireplace. His daughter's shaking forefinger indicated. Didst recognize her, child?" he asked. I think," the girl stammered, trying to summon her memory. "I think 'twas Goodwife Corey, father." "Martha Corey, didst say?" Putnam answered thoughtfully. He laid a poker across the yawning mouth of the fireplace, for witches were notoriously afraid of iron, since that was the metal which bound our Lord to the tree, and patted his daughter reassuringly on the shoulder. "Peace, child," he counselled. "Thou'lt be safe till daylight. I'll see the parson about this in the morning." Next day a conference was held in the parsonage of Salem Village Church. The Reverend Samuel Perris, pastor of the congregation, Edward Putnam, and Ezekiel Cheever talked earnestly of the state of affairs. But 12 days ago, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, both old women of Salem Village, and Tituba, the half-breed Indian slave of Mr. Perris himself, had been remanded to jail as witches, there to await execution on the gallows. Anne Putnam, A number of other young girls and women had been their chief accusers, declaring Goody Good and Goody Goody Good. Goody Good and Goody Osborne had grievously afflicted them with pains and torments. Because things like, because it's totally not because of certain other things that happen usually every month to young girls of growing. I'm not going to continue with that line, but you probably know what I'm talking about. Seriously, what? With the arrest and imprisonment of the witches, the good citizens of Salem had breathed a sigh of relief. For though the devil was mighty, the Lord, aided by the Reverend Samuel Parris and the Salem magistrates, was mightier, and righteousness had triumphed over wickedness. Now, alas, another witch had risen to plague the congregation. Did say 'twas Goodwife Corey, the minister asked, in interest, perhaps something more in his deep-set eyes. Putnam answered. Goodwife Corey, the child said, astride her broomstick. This matter needs our service, Mr. Parris interrupted. My brethren, let us pray. Then you must away to Salem Farms to question this wretched woman. In Salem Farms, where the town of West Peabody now stands, was the substantial farmhouse of Giles Corey, husbandman. Corey was past his 80th birthday, but a better man in strength and endurance than many only half his age. Neighbours told wonderingly how he could cut a wider swath with his scythe than any man in the hayfield, how he had been known to lift a keg of cider to his mouth and drink from the bunghole, as though from a mug, and how a drunken farmhand, relying on the old man's age to render him feeble, had paid for his folly with his life when he made a murderous assault on his employer. The labourer had attacked Corey with a flail, and the old man had defended himself so stoutly with his bare fists that the other subsequently died of the beating he received. Several of the neighbours had little cause to love Giles Corey. When some of them had wrongfully accused him of burning another's barn, he had an action for slander against them, and won substantial damages. Corey's wife Martha was his third spouse, and a fitting mate for him. Though past 60, she could turn out more work than any woman in the neighbourhood, and the uniform perfection of her butter and constantly healthy condition of her chickens and geese were matters for envious conversation among the farmwives. Some there were who hinted darkly that her good luck came not alone from industry, and that the know-how but might be attributed to the sort of help no Christian woman dare accept. Another cause the neighbours had to regard the Coreys askance was their attitude toward the arrests for witchcraft. When residents of the village and farms alike were crying out upon Goody Osborne and Goody Good, the Coreys stood aloof, Martha Corey declaring she would not convict a dog of egg-sucking on the testimony of hysterical children. As for Tituba, the minister's Indian slave, who had confessed herself a witch and implicated Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne with her, Goodwife Corey had hinted the Indian woman's pious master knew more about that confession than he cared to tell. Anne Putnam, the 12-year-old girl whose testimony, without cross-examination, had sworn away the lives of Mrs. Good and Mrs. Osborne, had heard Martha Corey declare she ought to have been soundly spanked, that she was a tale-inventing jade. Now Anne Putnam had told her father it was Martha Corey who entered her bedchamber astride a witch's broomstick. On the morning of March 12, 1692, Edward Putnam and Ezekiel Cheever rode into the barnyard of the Corey farmhouse and clambered on the kitchen door with their sword hilts. I know why you come, Martha Corey said as she swung the door open and recognized her visitors. You have come to say I am a witch, but I am none. I am a gospel woman. Putnam Cheever looked knowingly at each other. How came this woman to know their errand before they had opened their lips? You have been cried out against, Cheever said solemnly. The children of Salem village say you have appeared unto them. And did they say how I was dressed? The old lady interrupted. Did they tell you what clothes I wore? Here was a poser. No one had thought to ask Anne Putnam what clothes the witch wore when she appeared, but certainly she must have worn some. Puritans, even when they sold their souls to the devil and became witches, never appeared in public or private save fully dressed. It's Straight back to Salem village rode Ezekiel Cheever and Edward Putnam to question Anne regarding the witch's dress. When they arrived, they found the evil one's work had preceded them. Anne Putnam had talked with her friends and playmates. Now all were undergoing terrible agonies, crying out they were being cruelly pinched and bitten by some invisible person. Between times they were crawling beneath chairs and tables, sticking out their tongues at fathers and mothers, and acting generally as no well-behaved Puritan children ever acted when not under the spell of some powerful witch or wizard. The naivete on display is truly amazing. What clothes wore the witch when she appeared last night? Putnam asked the daughter. The girls strove to recall, and fell to sobbing bitterly. I cannot tell. She was all wrapped round with a blaze of hellfire. I could not see her clothes. No one asked Anne Putnam how she knew the blaze to be that of hellfire, or how such fire differed from that commonly seen on the chimney hearth. The wicked witch's scheme was exposed. She had asked if the child could describe her clothes when she well knew her enveloping sheet of hellfire prevented her clothing from being seen. A warrant was forthwith issued for the arrest of Martha Corey, housewife of Salem Farms. The Pitmans had not perfected their shorthand system in 1692, and all court reporting which had come down to us from that time consists of abbreviated longhand notes. But the Reverend Samuel Perris, pastor of Salem Village Church, apparently added the duties of court reporter to those of assistant magistrate and prosecutor, since we have the following transcript of Martha Corey's examination preserved in his handwriting. By Magistrate John Hathorne. Question. You are now in the hands of authority. Tell me now, why do you hurt these children? Answer. I do not. Question. Who doth? Answer. Pray give me leave to go and pray. This request was repeated several times. We did not send for you to pray, but to tell why you hurt these children. Answer. I am an innocent person. I never had to do with witchcraft since I was born. I am a gospel woman. How could you tell, then, that the child was bid to observe what clothes you wore when someone came to speak with you? I suspected it. You dare thus to lie in all this assembly? I expect the truth. Speak now and tell who told you what clothes. Nobody. At this point, one of the afflicted children suddenly cried out, Look, look. There stands a great black man beside her. He is whispering in her ear. Mr. Parris records this incident, but fails to give the name of the afflicted in his notes. Magistrate Hathorne immediately asked the old lady what her invisible counsellor said, and she replied, We must not believe all these distracted children, sir. Thereupon, to quote Mr. Parris's notes, there was extreme agony among all the afflicted. It was noted that, when she bit her lip, again quoting the Reverend Scribe's report, several of the afflicted were bitten. The marshal said she had bit her lip, and immediately the afflicted were in uproar. In such circumstance, it is not surprising that Hathorne and Corvin, the magistrates, should have found sufficient grounds for holding the old lady for the autumn assizes. She was accordingly lodged in jail till the court should convene in September. Her trial, the fall term of court, presents little difference from similar hearings, save for one singular incident. Among the afflicted was a young matron, a Mrs. Pope, wife of a well-to-do citizen of Salem. During the trial, this Christian woman hurled her muff at the accused as she stood in the prisoner's dock. Her shot, as is often the way when women throw missiles, went wild, but if she lacked accuracy of aim, she certainly was not wanting in spirit. Stooping, she unfastened the buckle of her heavy, rough-weather brogan and flung it with all her might at Martha Corey. Practice had improved her marksmanship. The iron-studded heel of the heavy foot-gear struck the old lady full in the mouth. Tipstaves and court attendants made no move to interfere. With bruised and swollen lips, Martha Corey stood to receive sentence of death by hanging. Another entry in the Reverend Mr. Parris's notes furnishes us with the penultimate chapter of Martha Corey's tragedy. Accordingly, this 14th September, the four aforesaid brethren, Lieutenant Nathaniel Putnam, and 2 deacons of Salem village, went with the pastor to her in Salem prison, whom we found very obdurate, justifying herself and condemning all that had done anything to her discovery or condemnation, whereupon, after a little discourse, for her imperiousness would not suffer much, and after prayer the dreadful sentence of excommunication was pronounced against her. 6 days after Martha Corey's arrest on a charge of witchcraft, her husband Jill Corey was hailed before the magistrates on a similar accusation. The same afflicted children who had sworn away his wife's life appeared in the role of prosecuting witness against the husband, and so greatly did they suffer that though the old man stood a good 10 yards from them, his hands were lashed behind his back to keep him from pinching the girls by magic. After the girl's tale of hauntings, pinchings, beatings, and other abuses had been told, Giles Corey was permitted to speak in his own behalf. But when he declared himself innocent, the afflicted children forthwith fell to the floor, some in a dead faint, others writhing and groaning in agony. It is enough to work magic. Is it not enough to work magic at other times, Magistrate? That Hathorne asked the prisoner sternly as he beheld the sufferings of the afflicted. Must you be at it in the face of authority? Again the old man denied his guilt, and the magistrate interrupted him. Why do you tell such unchristian lies against these witnesses? Throughout the short hearing of Giles Corey's case, the afflicted seemed almost beside themselves. If he held his head on one side, the better to hear the judge's words, the heads of the afflicted were all held on one side while they cried aloud that his magic compelled them to imitate his movements. He drew in his cheeks, their cheeks instantly were drawn in. There was little testimony in his case. The cries and general demeanour of the childish accusers were enough to convince the magistrates they had a dangerous and powerful servant of Satan in custody. He was remanded to jail to await the grand jury in his action. September 7, 1692, Jill Corey was led into court to answer an indictment for witchcraft. The court clerk read the document and, as was customary, asked the defendant whether he pleaded guilty or not guilty. Corey, though past the allotted 70 years, was strong in spirit. "'Tis nonsense," he cried in a clear, ringing voice. "To peril a man's life on the idle tales of children is foolery. I will not answer to such an indictment." Court and spectators sat aghast. Had not the witnesses on whose testimony Jill Corey was indicted been sworn on the Holy Scriptures? Did not those same Scriptures declare witches and wizards existed and must be put to death? Whoever called a trial for witchcraft foolery denied the Bible and mocked at God. This man was a blasphemer as well as a wizard. What to do? No man could be legally sentenced unless he had previously been found guilty by a jury after a plea of not guilty, or had been saved by the court's time by pleading guilty. The court took counsel upon the case, then decided to apply the penalty of peine forte et dure. This was literally applying pressure to the accused, since it consisted of laying him on his back and piling upon his chest an abdomen as great a weight of timber, stone, or iron as he could bear, and more, till he either died or agreed to answer guilty or not guilty to the indictment charging him with the crime. Note, while the terrible penalty of peine forte et dure was inflicted only once by a court in America, it was by no means unknown in England. Juliana Quick died by it in 1442. Anthony Arrowsmith suffered a like fate in 1598, as did Walter Calverley in 1605, and Major Strangways in 1657. A similar case is recorded at the Cambridge Assizes as late as 1741, though the victim is unnamed. The punishment was abrogated by Act of Parliament in 1772. The English law differed from that of continental European nations in that it strictly forbade torture of accused or witnesses to make them testify, but an ancient statute dating to the reign of Henry IV permitted this form of torture to those who delayed justice by refusing to answer an indictment. It mattered not that the accused's conviction was a foregone conclusion. He must have his day in court, and judge and jury must indeed go through the motions of according him a fair trial before sentence could be legally pronounced and executed. On Monday, September 19, 1692, Jill Corey was taken to a spot near what was later to be the site of the Howard Street burial ground in Brown Street, Salem, laid on his back and buried under a great pile of timber and rocks. Puritan consciousness battled Puritan conscience. Puritan conscience battled Puritan conscience. The firmness of purpose which led the conscientious officers, blinded by the crude superstition they mistook for religion, to torture aged Jill Corey, was the same firmness of purpose which made the old man refuse to go through the farce of a trial for a crime he knew to be impossible. It was the same uncompromising spirit which had already wrested a new world from, I'm not going to say this, from who? From people in of the woods, and would later hold it against red-coated men of the king. Jill Corey suffered for being ahead of his time. He denied the existence of witchcraft in a day when nearly everyone firmly believed in a personal devil with horns, hoof, and tail. When the process of applying pressure commenced, Corey begged the officers to pile as much weight on as possible, that his sufferings might the sooner be ended. Robert Califf, a liberal-minded merchant of Salem, who did all in his power to stem the rising tide of madness during the witchcraft prosecutions, relates a horrifying incident of Jill Corey's death. In pressing his tongue being pressed out of his mouth, the sheriff with his cane forced it back again while he was dying. Martha Corey was hanged on Gallows Hill, Salem, September 22, 1692, 3 days after her aged husband suffered the cruelest death ever imposed by civilized men on the North American continent. An old ballad written in the contemporary style tells of Jill Corey's death in these quaint words. Jill Corey was a wizard strong, a stubborn wretch was he, and fit was he to hang on high upon ye locust tree. So when before ye magistrates for trial he did come, he would not true confession make, but was completely dumb. Jill Corey, said the magistrate, what hast thou here to plead? To these that now accuse thy soul of crimes and horrid deed. Jill Corey, he said not a word, no single word spake he. Jill Corey, said he, the magistrates, will press it out of thee. They got them then a heavy beam, they laid it on his breast, they loaded it with heavy stones, and hard upon him pressed. More weight, now saith the wretched man, more weight, again he cried, and he would not confession make, but wickedly he died. So that's that one. And now, I believe, what we can do to sort of, I'm just going to check, there we go, to close out for today would be another, Lovecraft and Eddy collaboration. Now I just need to find this particular link to it. March 1924. March 1924. I would prefer if I was able to read it from there, but let me just go. It says it's on page 22 to 24, so it's 3 pages. And okay, this is definitely. Wait a minute, what is this? There's a story in here written supposedly by Harry Houdini, so I definitely think that we would have to go through that at some time, but I have to actually find the specific page for what we're looking for now. Okay, this issue definitely seems to have some interesting things in it. Okay, so because this issue doesn't have a cover title illustration, we're going to use the cover for. We're going to use the cover for this particular issue of Weird Tales. Okay. Let me just try and see if I could possibly find it separately. Okay, Weird Tales, March 1924, and we're just going to try and find the cover for it separately. Here it might be. There we go. Just going to copy this. I definitely think we need to. There we go. We definitely need to do this Harry Houdini thing. So now we're going to be reading Ashes by H.P. Lovecraft and C.M. Eddy Jr., which again is
From what I gather, it's basically just mostly written by Lovecraft, except very small bits of plot from C.M. Eddy, as was usual with his ghost writing stories, where he usually wrote most of what those were about, specific, like the Curse of Yig, for example. Now, let us go. This one's only 3 pages, so let us go and. So it goes. Hello, Bruce. Haven't seen you in a dog's age. Come in. I threw open the door and he followed me into the room. His gaunt, ungainly figure sprawled awkwardly into the chair I indicated, and he twirled his hat between nervous fingers. His deep-set eyes wore a worried, haunted look, and he glanced furtively around the room as if searching for a hidden something which might unexpectedly pounce upon him. His face was haggard and colourless. The corners of his mouth twitched spasmodically. "What's the matter, old man? You look as if you'd seen a ghost. Brace up." I crossed to the buffet and poured a small glass of wine from the decanter. "Drink this." He downed it with a hasty gulp and took to toying with his hat again. "Thanks, Prague. I don't feel quite myself tonight." Well, shouldn't if you're thinking an entire city's in the room with you. "You don't look it either. What's wrong?" Malcolm Bruce shifted uneasily in his chair. I eyed him in silence for a moment, wondering what could possibly affect the man so strongly. I knew Bruce as a man of steady nerves and iron will. To find him so visibly upset was in itself unusual. I passed cigars, and he selected one automatically. It was not until the second cigar had been lighted that Bruce broke the silence. His nervousness was apparently gone. Once more he was the dominant, self-reliant figure I knew of old. "Prague," he began, "I've just been through the most devilish, gruesome experience that ever befell a man. I don't know whether I dare tell it or not, for fear you'll think I've gone crazy, and I wouldn't blame you if you did. But it's true, every word of it." He paused dramatically and blew a few rings of smoke in the air. I smiled. Many a weird tale I had listened to of that self-same table. There must have been some kink in my personality that inspired confidence, for I had been told stories that some men would have been given years of their life to have heard. And yet, despite my love of the bizarre and the dangerous, and my longing to explore the far reaches of little-known lands, I had been doomed to a life of prosaic, flat, uneventful business. "Do you happen to have heard of Professor Van Allister?" asked Bruce. "You don't mean Arthur Van Allister?" "The same. Then you know him." "I should say so. Known him for years. Ever since he resigned as professor of chemistry at the college so he could have more time for his experiments. Why, I even helped him choose the plans for that soundproof laboratory of his on the top floor of his home. Up to a year ago, we were pals, and he got so busy with his confounded experiments he couldn't find the time to be chummy. You may recall, Prague, that when we were in college together, I used to dabble quite a bit in chemistry." I nodded, and Bruce continued. "About 4 months ago, I found myself out of a job. Van Allister advertised for an assistant, and I answered. He remembered me from college days, and I managed to convince him I knew enough about chemistry to warrant a trial. He had a young lady doing his secretarial work, a Miss Marjorie Purdy. She was one of those strict attention to business types, and was as good-looking as she was efficient. She had been helping Van Allister a bit in his laboratory, and I soon discovered she took a genuine interest in puttering around making experiments of her own. Indeed, she spent nearly all her spare time with us in the laboratory. It was only natural that such companionship should result in a close friendship, and it wasn't long before I began to depend on her to help me in different experiments. In difficult experiments, when the professor was busy, I never could seem to stump her. The girl took to chemistry as a duck to water. About 2 months ago, Van Allister had the laboratory partitioned off and made a separate workroom for himself. He told us that he was about to enter upon a series of experiments which, if successful, would bring him everlasting fame. He flatly refused to make us his confidence in any way, shape, or manner. From that time on, Miss Purdy and I were left alone more and more. Checking the chat for a second. For days at a time, the professor would would retire to the seclusion of his new workshop, sometimes not even appearing for his meals. That meant, too, that we had more spare time on our hands. Our friendship ripened. I felt a growing admiration for the trim young woman who seemed perfectly content to fuss around smelly bottles and sticky messes, gowned in white from head to foot, even to the rubber gloves she wore. Day before yesterday, Van Allister invited us into his workshop. At last I have achieved success, he announced, holding up for our inspection a small bottle containing a colourless liquid. I have here what will rank as the greatest chemical discovery ever known. I'm going to prove its efficiency right before your eyes. Bruce, will you bring me one of the rabbits, please? I went back into the other room and brought him one of the rabbits we kept together with guinea pigs for experimental purposes. Sorry, what is it? Sorry, I just want to drink something, and then there was just something really weird and gross in there. The frick? Might have been a bit old. Might have been a bit neat, actually. Still, one doesn't expect that. You're drinking, and suddenly there's like this slimy brown thing, viscous, and I think it was a bit of the other meat I was had before. But yeah, that was gross. At last I have achieved success, he announced, holding up. Yes, holding up. He put the little animal into a small glass box, just large enough to hold it, and closed the cover. Then he set a glass funnel in a hole in the top of the box, and we drew nearer to watch the experiment. He uncorked the bottle and poised it above the rabbit's prison. Now, to prove whether my weeks of effort have resulted in success or failure. Slowly, methodically, he emptied the contents of the bottle into the funnel, and we watched it trickle into the compartment with the frightened animal. Miss Purdy uttered a suppressed cry, and I rubbed my eyes to make sure that they had not deceived me. For in the case where but a moment before there had been a live, terrified rabbit, there was now nothing but a little pile of soft white ashes. Professor Van Allister turned to us with an air of supreme satisfaction. His face radiated ghoulish glee, and his eyes were alight with a weird, insane gleam. When he spoke, his voice took on a tone of mastery. Bruce, and you too, Miss Purdy, it has been your privilege to witness the first successful trial of a preparation that will revolutionize the world. It will instantaneously reduce to a fine ash anything with which it comes in contact except glass. Just think what that means. An army equipped with glass bombs filled with my compound could annihilate the world. Wood, metal, stone, brick, everything swept away before them, leaving no more trace than that rabbit I just experimented upon, just a pile of soft white ashes. I glanced at Miss Purdy. Her face had gone as white as the apron she wore. We watched Van Allister as he transferred all that was left of the bunny to a small bottle and neatly labelled it. I'll admit that I was suffering a mental chill myself by the time he dismissed us, and we left him alone behind the tightly closed doors of his workshop. Sorry, I need to close this one. Once safely outside, Miss Purdy's nerves gave way completely. She reeled and would have fallen had I not caught her in my arms. The feel of her soft, yielding body held close to my own was the last straw. I cast prudence to the winds and crushed her tightly to my breast. Kiss after kiss I pressed upon her full red lips until her eyes opened, and I saw the love light reflected in them. I'm assuming this bit wasn't written by Lovecraft, considering he doesn't really like that sort of thing in his fiction. After a delicious eternity, we came back to Earth again, long enough to realize that the laboratory was no place for such ardent demonstrations. At any moment, Van Allister might come out of his retreat, and if he should discover our love-making in its present state of mind, we dared not think of what might happen. For the rest of the day, I was like a man in a dream. It's a wonder to me that I succeeded in accomplishing anything at all. My body was merely an automaton, a well-trained machine going about its appointed tasks, while my mind soared into far-away realms of delightful daydreaming. Marjorie kept busy with her secretarial work for the rest of the day, and not once did I lay eyes on her until my tasks in the laboratory were completed. That night we gave over to the joys of our new-found happiness. Prague, I shall remember that night as long as I live. The happiest moment I have ever known was when Marjorie Purdy promised to become my wife. Yesterday was another day of unalloyed bliss. All day long my sweetheart and I worked side by side. Then followed another night of love-making. If you've never been in love with the only girl in the world, Prague, you can't understand the delirious joy that comes from the very thought of her. And Marjorie returned my devotion 100-fold. She gave herself unreservedly into my keeping. Along about noontime today, I needed something to complete an experiment, and I stepped over the drugstore for it. When I returned, I missed Marjorie. I looked for her hat and coat, and they were gone. The professor had not shown himself since the experiment upon the rabbit, and was locked in his workshop. I asked the servants, but none of them had seen her leave the house, nor had she left any message for me. As the afternoon wore on, I grew frantic. Evening came, and still no sign of my dear little girl. Although all thought of work was forgotten, I paced the floor of my room like a caged lion. Every jangle of the phone or ring at the door bolstered up my faltering hopes of some word from her. But each time I was doomed to disappointment. Each minute seemed an hour, each hour an eternity. Good God, Prague, you can't imagine how I suffered. From the heights of sublime love, I mentally plunged to the darkest depths of despair. I conjured visions of all sorts of terrible fates overtaking her. Still not a word did I hear. It seemed to me that I had lived a lifetime, but my watch told me it was only 7:30 when the butler told me that Van Allister wanted me in the laboratory. I was in no mood for experiments, but while I was under his roof, he was my master and was for me to obey. The professor was in his workshop, the door slightly ajar. He called to me to close the door of the laboratory and join him in the little room. In my state of mind, my brain photographed every minute detail of the scene which met my eyes. In the center of the room, on a marble tabletop, was a glass case about the shape and size of a coffin. It was filled almost to the brim with that same colourless liquid which the small bottle had contained 2 days before. At the left of the glass-topped tabouret was a newly labelled glass jar. I could not repress an involuntary shudder as I realized that it was filled with soft white ashes. There I saw something that almost made my heart stop beating. On a chair in a far corner of the workshop was the hat and coat of the girl who had pledged her life to mine, the girl whom I had vowed to cherish and protect while life should last. My senses were numbed, my soul surcharged with horror as realization flashed over me. There could be but one explanation. The ashes in that jar were the ashes of Marjorie Purdy. The world stood still for one long, terrible moment, and then I went mad, stark, staring mad. The next I can remember, the professor and I were locked in a desperate struggle. Old as he was, he still possessed a strength nearly equal to mine, and he had the added advantage of calm possession. Closer and closer he forced me to the glass coffin. A few moments more, and my ashes would join those of the girl I had loved. I stumbled against the tabouret, my fingers closed over the jar of ashes. With one last superhuman effort, I raised it high above my head and brought it down with crushing force upon the skull of my antagonist. His arm relaxed, his limb form drooped in a senseless heap on the floor. Still reacting upon impulse, I raised the silent form of the professor and carefully, lest I should spill some of it on the floor, lowered the body into the casket of death. A moment, and it was over. Professor and liquid both were gone, and in their places was a little pile of soft white ash. As I gazed at my handiwork, the brainstorm passed away, and I came face to face with the cold, hard truth that I had killed a fellow being. An unnatural calm possessed me. I knew that there was not one single shred of evidence against me, barring the fact that I was the last one known to be alone with the Professor. Nothing remained but ashes. I put on my hat and coat and told the butler that the Professor had left word he was not to be disturbed and I was going out for the evening. Once outside, all my self-possession vanished. My nerves were shot to pieces. I don't know where I went, only that I wandered aimlessly here and there until I found myself outside your apartment just a little while ago. Prague, I tell you, if I must talk with Prague, I felt as if I must talk with someone, that I must unburden my tortured mind. I knew that I could trust you, old pal, so I've told you the whole story. Here I am to do. Here I am. Do with me as you will. Life holds nothing more for me now that Marjorie is gone. Bruce's voice trembled with emotion and broke as he mentioned the name of the girl he loved. I leaned across the table and gazed searchingly into the eyes of the abject figure that slouched dejectedly in the big chair. Then I rose, put on my hat and coat, crossed to Bruce, who had buried his hands in his arms and was shaking with violent sobs. Bruce! Malcolm Bruce raised his eyes. Bruce, listen to me. Are you sure Marjorie Purdy is dead? Am I sure that? His eyes widened at the suggestion, and he sat erect with a sudden start. Exactly, I went on. Are you positive that the ashes in that jar were the ashes of Marjorie Purdy? Why, I see here, Prague. What are you driving at? Then you're not sure. You saw the girl's hat and coat in that chair, and in your state of mind you jumped at conclusions. The ashes must be those of the missing girl. The Professor must have made away with her and all that. Come now, did Van Allister tell you anything? I don't know what he said. I tell you, I went berserk, mad. Then you come along with me. If she's not dead, she must be somewhere in that house, and if she is there, we're going to find her. On the street we hailed a taxi, and in a few moments the butler admitted us to Van Allister's home. Bruce let us into the laboratory with his key. The door of the workshop was still ajar. My eye swept the room in a comprehensive survey. At the left, over near the window, was a closed door. I strode across the room and tried the knob, but it refused to yield. Where does that lead? Just an anteroom where the Professor keeps his apparatus. Well, kept, rather. All the same, that door's coming open, I returned grimly. Stepping back a pace or two, I planted a well-directed kick upon the door. Another and still another, and the framework around the lock gave way. Bruce, with an inarticulate cry, sped across the room to a huge mahogany chest. He selected one of the keys on his ring, inserted it in the lock, and flung back the cover with trembling hands. Here she is, Prague. Quick, get her out where there's air. Together we bore the limp figure of the girl into the laboratory. Bruce hastily mixed a concoction which he forced between her lips. A second dose and her eyes slowly opened. Her bewildered glance travelled around the room, at last resting on Bruce, and her eyes lighted with sudden happy recognition. Later, after the first few moments of reunion, the girl told us her story. After Malcolm went out this afternoon, the Professor sent word to me to come into the workshop, as he often summoned me to do some errand or other. I thought nothing of it, and to save time he took my hat and coat along. He closed the door of the little room, and without warning attacked me from behind. He overpowered me, tied me hand and foot. It was needless to gag me, as you know, the laboratory is absolutely soundproof. Then he produced a huge Newfoundland dog he had secured from somewhere or other and reduced it to ashes before my very eyes and put the ashes in a glass jar that was on a taburet in the workshop. Seems a bit odd sort of a course of events, but sure. He went into the anteroom and from the chest where you found me took out the glass casket. At last it seemed a casket to my terror-stricken eyes. He mixed enough of his horrible liquid to fill it almost to the brim. Then he told me that but one thing remained. That was to perform the experiment upon a human being. She shuddered at the recollection. He dilated at length upon what a privilege it would be for anyone to sacrifice his life in such a manner for such a cause. Then he calmly informed me that he had selected you as the subject of his experiment, and that I was to play the role of witness. I fainted. The professor must have feared some sort of intrusion, for the next I remember is waking inside the chest where you discovered me. It was stifling. Every breath I took came harder and harder. I thought of you, Malcolm, thought of the wonderful happy hours we had spent together the last few days. I wondered what I would do when you were gone. I ever prayed that he would kill me too. My throat grew parched and dry. Everything went black before my eyes. Next I opened them to find myself here with you, Malcolm. Her voice sank to a hoarse, nervous whisper. Where is the professor? Bruce silently led her into the workshop. She shivered as the coffin of glass came within her range of vision. Still silently, he crossed directly to the casket. Still silently, he crossed directly to the casket, and taking up a handful of the soft white ashes, let them sift slowly through his fingers. And that was Ashes by H.P. Lovecraft and C. Eddy. So that was that one. Now we have gone on for just over 2 hours. So far, we've read 5 stories today, and I believe this is a good time to conclude this thing for today. I definitely want tomorrow, if I can actually manage to stream tomorrow, like I hope to stream unless I get too exhausted by things. I wish to actually do a reading of the Houdini story from this issue of Weird Tales, but also to potentially read a story or two from one or two of the collections we've read through previously, especially the last caveman story we read. When we only read one story from that collection, I definitely want to go back at it again. So we'll see. Now, I will thank everyone for having come in to watch today's stream, and also to say that I definitely am happy that so many people came in to like the stream, and more than usual, which I assume is because of the title story mentioning Lovecraft. But I'm going to just now go in here, and I'm going to just share the PayPal and GoFundMe link in the description in the comments, and to help us with certain things. Both currently, I am dealing with not just the yet another move that I've been forced into, but also some general issues with dealing with the health insurance company. So there's also that. So I'm just going to copy this. Sorry, not that long. That's just for the GoFundMe. And hopefully I'll be able to do something tomorrow. Sorry. I'll definitely try and do a proper recording as well, but I don't have a microphone at the moment, so I'm a little wary of the sound quality of edited videos being the same as the streams. The streams are a bit longer, so I do feel that those quality can be slightly excused, whereas I feel a little self-conscious about that. I still want to make proper short-form edited content, so I'll give it a go and see how that works out. So we'll see. So thanks everyone for coming in to watch, and I'll see you soon, hopefully tomorrow. So peace.